Land of plenty, land of poverty. Venezuela ought to be soaring, a great success story in South America, with exceptional oil wealth spreading prosperity to all. Instead, it's a country sinking under the weight of ferocious political division. Some blame President Hugo Chavez and his radical socialist revolution.
The capitalism was unfair, which I'm willing to grant. This is worse. So let's go back to slightly unfair rather than totally unfair.
But Hugo Chavez inspires fierce loyalty too, in a land of polarized politics.
Ordinary Venezuelans who live in this neighborhood will defend the president.
So can Venezuela heal its deep divide over oil, politics, and Hugo Chavez? Oil pays for this, politics drives it, and Hugo Chavez takes the credit. It's Metro Cable, a new cable car system for the Venezuelan capital, Caracas. And all thanks to the father of the socialist revolution, President Hugo Chavez. There's really no doubting that this is a technological triumph, a series of interconnecting cable cars which bring some of the poorest in Venezuela much closer to the wealth of the capital. But you have to ask whether it's also an extravagant showcase for Hugo Chavez's socialist revolution. It seems in some ways to conceal the fact that so little else has gone on in the country, so little of Venezuela's oil wealth has been spent on similar infrastructure projects which are desperately needed to try and bridge the gap between the richest and the poorest in this society. His government has just spent $250 million of Venezuela's oil wealth on this cable car system, linking precarious shanty towns to the high-rise heart of Caracas. And there's no doubting the gratitude of the president's most loyal supporters among the poor.
Much as people say it's mad, or totally mad, I want to thank him for it, and I give thanks in the name of my community to my president.
Travel on the cable car is free, and Maria is just one of those who feels like a winner under Hugo Chavez. But there are winners and losers. A lot of Venezuela's working class don't feel like winners from socialism. I've travelled just outside Caracas to a private housing development nationalised by President Chavez. It's part of an accelerating programme of enforced public ownership. I'm meeting Wally Garcia, who sees himself as a victim. He's showing me the small flat he's buying. He's so nervous about the uncertainties of nationalisation, the family are finishing the flat themselves, just to get in quickly. To make matters worse, nationalisation of another company means Wally's lost his job and is having to freelance now.
What
has died here is hope, the hope of having a better quality of life. As far as improving your life, there has been a decline in the number of people who are willing to invest, to take the initiative. It seems as if the government wants everybody to be equal, but not equal in improving their lives, but equal in getting poorer.
So what impression do I take away from all that? Well, frankly, it's complicated. But most of all, I suppose, that Wally just seems to be an ordinary Venezuelan who's somehow been trapped, caught between ideologies, and he's a bit of a hapless victim. First he loses his salaried job because his business is taken over by the state, and then suddenly he finds the house that he's been saving for, the flat, well, the whole building's been taken over by the state. It's the uncertainty, it's the worry that's causing him so much heartache.
Detalle, ¿no? Bien bonito. Ese edificio ahí que es, ese es un teatro antiguo, ¿no era?
Who's behind all this? Well, one man. President Hugo Chavez, who likes to take over, expropriate private property live on air as part of his regular TV show, Allo Presidente.
Expropiese, señor alcalde. Expropiese. Expropiese.
Expropriate, he says repeatedly. We're in the historic centre of Caracas, and the president is eyeing up privately owned shops he thinks have no right to be here.
Proyecto arquitectónico histórico del... Bueno, estamos en el corazón de Caracas.
So the losers here were the staff at the expropriated jewellery store. President Chavez may have said allo to the nation, but it was an instant goodbye for them, kicked out the next day. To these people, his rule seemed arbitrary, capricious, even cruel. But a group of Chavez supporters outside saw it quite differently, as a triumph of socialism. And now this is the clothing store put in its place, and not just any clothing store. Alba sells heavily discounted clothes with government subsidies, so public expenditure is providing a very popular treat.
Women's clothes, men's clothes, children's and sporting clothing, all types of clothes at a very good price.
A shirt here costs 75 bolivars. In the capitalist market it costs 350. That's 3 or 4 times more.
And nothing better illustrates division in Venezuela than the story of this store, the winners and the losers. It stands directly opposite Parliament, where opposition to President Chavez has increased dramatically.
What we are living in Venezuela is the classical military government plus a left-wing radical ideology plus the control of the whole economy. This is a combination which is lethal for democracy in any country.
Lethal for democracy, that's the opposition charge against Hugo Chavez. So is that fair when you consider he's been elected president of Venezuela 3 times? But this is how Hugo Chavez originally burst onto the world stage. Chavez led a military coup back in 1992, trying and failing to grab power after decades of more or less corrupt rule in Venezuela. He was released after 2 years in jail, and the young army officer built his popularity by denouncing the rottenness he wanted to replace.
With these corrupt people, you have to take everything they've stolen away from them and put them in prison, not under house arrest. Put them in a cell and turn them into a public disgrace. That's necessary for Venezuela's moral recovery.
Finally elected president in 1998, sworn in most recently in 2006, Hugo Chavez has transformed Venezuela's politics and presidential dress. From the start, supporters were ecstatic as state control of key industries was increased, including oil. But many oil workers were dismayed, their bosses sacked, production falling. A general strike polarized opinion, and Venezuela was headed down a road of division. The president's very deliberate radicalism and his choice of friends made him enemies both at home in Venezuela and abroad. Reliance on Cuba's Fidel Castro appalled those on the right. Alliance with Iran's President Ahmadinejad inflamed Washington. and welcoming to Venezuela a substantial armada from Russia's navy confirmed his critics' fears. Using the UN stage to insult President George W. Bush divided the world.
Yesterday, the devil came here. Right here.
Even if President Chavez now is more conciliatory towards the Obama administration. So, to supporters in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez is a brilliant populist. To critics, he's an outright threat to freedom and the rule of law.
The government, his real fear is people itself. His real fear is that people don't share the radical agenda of the government. Even those who support President Chavez as a person, they don't share the radical agenda of Chavez. They don't want the agenda of confrontation.
Think Venezuela, think oil, and think big. This bridge across Lake Maracaibo is taking us to the birthplace of Venezuela's vast oil business. Past the giant billboard face of President Hugo Chavez, who's making it very clear oil wealth fuels and funds his socialist revolution. But all is not well in Venezuela's economy, the only one in Latin America which is not growing but shrinking instead. Sinking in a localized recession unique on this continent. This really is the heart of Venezuela's oil industry, the original source of its enormous oil wealth for almost 100 years. But the question still remains, after many decades in which oil revenues have often been squandered, is the present government making proper or foolish use of all that money?
This is the part of the world in which the Spaniards who discovered it thought they'd find El Dorado, where the streets would be paved with gold. Well, as a matter of fact, they weren't far wrong.
This was the BBC in Venezuela over 50 years ago, and a report by Robert Key for the Panorama programme in 1958.
Because the Spaniards were only wrong about one thing. It wasn't gold the country was paved with, but oil.
Here, from under Lake Maracaibo and its shores, comes 1/9 of the entire oil production of the world. The oil lies in concessions granted to American companies and the Anglo-Dutch company Shell.
And Venezuela has always relied, arguably far too much, on oil revenue. Alberto Quiroz spent a career in the business, eventually heading Shell in Venezuela.
It keeps on being more and more important because all other industries in the country are now, in recession. So the country is more and more depending on oil for its survival. But the reason why the oil industry isn't doing too well is because all the income of the oil business is being diverted into social programs. So, we're wasting a lot of money. We're throwing away a lot of money for really very little in exchange.
This is the sort of welfare project he's complaining about. In Maracaibo, Venezuela's second city, some of the country's many poor people are queuing to buy food at unrealistically low prices. This is an artificial socialist market created by President Chavez. The subsidies to bring prices down come from oil revenue, and it's one of many government welfare programs.
Milk, margarine, flour, beans and tuna are the things I'm buying.